This discourse, titled "The Lord Gave and the Lord Hath Taken Away, Blessed be the Name of the Lord," was published in the book For Upbuilding Discourses by Søren Kierkegaard in 1843. It starts with the verses, "Then Job arose and rent his mantle and shaved his head and fell upon the ground and worshipped and said, Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." The discourse discusses Prophet Job, who was a descendant of Prophet Abraham. His mother was the daughter of Prophet Lot or Luth, and his wife was a direct descendant of Prophet Joseph or Yusuf. Prophet Job lived in Rome with his dear wife Rahma and 14 children, and he was a prophet who was immensely blessed by God. He was strong and wealthy. He was healthy. He had large plots of land, abundant livestock, and a righteous and beautiful family. He was also a community leader who was highly respected and loved by his people. Despite his status and wealth, he was never arrogant. He was always humble. He readily helped the deprived and constantly thanked and glorified God for everything he was blessed with. He was then tested by the loss of wealth, health, and children, and Kierkegaard mentions this story in these words. "In the land toward the east there lived a man whose name was Job. He was blessed with lands, innumerable herds, and rich pastures. His words had lifted up the fallen and had strengthened the feeble knees. His tent was blessed as if it rested in the lap of heaven, and in this tent he lived with his 7 sons and 3 daughters, and the secret of the Lord abode there with him. And Job was an old man. His joy in life was his pleasure in his children, over whom he watched that no evil might come upon them. There he sat one day alone by his fireside, while his children were gathered at a festival at the oldest brother's house. There he offered burnt offerings for each one individually. There he also disposed his heart to joy in the thought of his children. As he sat there in the quiet confidence of happiness, there came a messenger, and before he could speak, there came another, and while this one was still speaking, there came a third. But the fourth messenger brought news concerning his sons and daughters, that the house had been overthrown and had buried them all. Then Job stood up and rent his mantle and shaved his head and fell down upon the ground and worshipped." Kierkegaard says that Job has the significance he has because of his actions and not his words. The same way Abraham, as expressed in fear and trembling, has the significance he has because of his firm belief that God will not do injustice to him in demanding that he sacrifice his son, and he did not lose his faith. Kierkegaard says if Job had devoted his whole life to emphasizing the word, if he had regarded it as the sum and fulfillment of what a man ought to let life teach him, if he had constantly only taught it but had never himself practiced it, had never himself acted in accordance with what he taught, then Job would have been a different kind of man, his significance different. Then would Job's name have been forgotten, or it would have been unimportant whether anyone remembered it or not, the principal thing being the content of the word, the richness of the thought it embodied. This can be seen in how Job first said, "The Lord gave," and then said that the Lord took. He was grateful even when everything was taken from him, and did not lose his faith nor forgot his own teachings when he was overtaken by sorrow. Kierkegaard says, Job said, "The Lord gave." Is not this word irrelevant to the occasion? Does it not contain something different from what lay in the event itself? If a man in a single moment is deprived of everything dear to him, and deprived of the most precious of all, the loss will perhaps at first so overwhelm him that he will not even trust himself to express it, even if in his heart he is conscious before God that he has lost everything. Or he will not permit the loss to rest with its crushing weight upon his soul, but he will put it away from him, and in his heart's agitation he will say, "The Lord took." And thus to humble oneself before the Lord in silence and humility is indeed worthy of praise and emulation, and in the struggle such a man saves his soul though he loses all his gladness. But Job, at the moment when the Lord took everything, he did not say first, the Lord took, but he said first, the Lord gave. The word is short, but in its brevity, it perfectly expresses what it wishes to indicate, that Job's soul is not crushed down in silent submission to sorrow, but that his heart first expanded in gratitude, that the loss of everything first made him thankful to the Lord that he had given him all the blessings that he now took from him. Then Kierkegaard mentions three types of men who would react to the event differently than Job. The first man would be more sorrowful because of the memory of his happy days, and had he not seen happy days, the pain would be lesser. He says regarding the first man, perhaps there might be someone who on the day of sorrow was also reminded that he had seen happy days, and his soul would become even more impatient. Had he never known happiness, then the pain would not have overcome him. For what is pain, after all, other than an idea which he does not have, who knows nothing else? But now happiness had so educated and developed him as to make him conscious of the pain. Thus his happiness became pernicious to him. It was never lost but only lacking, and it tempted him more in the lack than ever before. What had been the delight of his eyes he desired to see again, and his ingratitude punished him by conjuring it up as more beautiful than it had formerly been. What his soul had rejoiced in, it now thirsted for again, and his ingratitude punished him by painting it as more desirable than it had previously been. What he had once been capable of doing, that he now wished to be able to do again, and his ingratitude punished him with visions that had never had reality. Thus, he condemned his soul to living famished in the never satisfied craving of want. I apologize for the noise in the background, that's just my kitten playing with her toys. The second man, Kierkegaard says, would invalidate the happy days because he would feel he had not enjoyed them because of the pain he feels now. He says regarding this, or there awakened a consuming passion in his soul because he had not even enjoyed the happy days in the right way, had not imbibed all the sweetness from their voluptuous abundance. If there might only be vouchsafed to him one little hour, if he might only regain the glory for a short time, so that he might satiate himself with happiness and thereby learn to disregard the pain. Then he abandoned his soul to a burning unrest. He would not acknowledge to himself whether the enjoyment he desired was worthy of a man, whether he ought not rather to thank God that his soul had not been so extravagant in the time of joy as it had now become in his unhappiness. He was not appalled by the thought that his desires were the cause of his perdition. He refused to be concerned by the fact that more wretched than all, his wretchedness was the worm of desire in his soul, which would not die. The third man, Kierkegaard says, would attempt to escape his grief or to belittle whatever good days had come his way. He says, perhaps there might be another man who at the moment of loss also remembered what he had possessed, but who had the audacity to try to prevent the loss from becoming intelligible to him. Even if it were lost, his defiant will would still be able to retain it as if it were not lost. He would not endeavor to bear the loss, but he chose to waste his strength in an impotent defiance, to lose himself in an insane preoccupation with the loss. Or in cowardice, he immediately avoided humbly attempting to understand it. Then oblivion opened its abyss not so much to the loss as to him, and he did not so much escape the loss in forgetfulness as he threw himself away. Or he lyingly sought to belittle the good which he had once enjoyed, as if it never had been beautiful, had never gladdened his heart. He thought to strengthen his soul by a wretched self-deception, as if strength lay in falsehood. Or he irrationally assured himself that life was not so hard as one imagined, that its terror was not as described, was not so hard to bear, if one, as you will remember that he had, as he did, began by not finding it terrifying to become such a person. However, Kierkegaard says that what Job did was different, and it was this. He says, "Let us rather, therefore, turn back to Job. On the day of sorrow when everything was lost, then he first thanked God who gave it, defrauded neither God nor himself, and while everything was being shaken and overthrown, he still remained what he had been from the beginning, honest and upright before God. He confessed that the blessing of the Lord had been merciful to him. He returned thanks for it. Therefore, it did not remain in his mind as a torturing memory. He confessed that the Lord had blessed richly and beyond all measure his undertakings. He had been thankful for this, and therefore the memory did not become to him a consuming unrest. He did not conceal from himself that everything had been taken from him. Therefore, the Lord who took it remained in his upright soul. He did not avoid the thought that it was lost. Therefore, his soul rested quietly until the explanation of the Lord again came to him and found his heart like the good earth, well cultivated in patience." Then Kierkegaard says that Job saw everything as coming from God and did not blame anyone else because he knew that everything happened with God's permission and no man could benefit or harm him if God did not allow it. He says, "The Lord took." Did Job say anything except the truth? Did he use an indirect expression to indicate what was direct? The word is short and it signifies the loss of everything. It naturally occurs to us to repeat it after him, since the expression itself has become a sacred proverb. But do we just as naturally link it to Job's thought? For was it not the Sabians who fell upon his peaceful herds and killed his servants? Did the messenger who brought the news say anything else? Was it not the lightning which destroyed the sheep and their shepherds? Did the messenger who brought the news mean something else, even though he called the lightning the fire from heaven? Was it not a windstorm from out of the desert which overturned the house and buried his children in the ruins? Did the messenger mention some other perpetrator, or did he name someone who sent the wind? Yet Job said, "The Lord took." In the very moment of receiving the message, he realized that it was the Lord who had taken everything. Who told Job this? Or was it not a sign of his fear of God that he thus shifted everything over to the Lord and justified him in doing it? And are we more devout, we who sometimes hesitate a long time to speak thus? Then Kierkegaard mentions other men who blame others for their misfortune. He says, "Perhaps there was a man who had lost everything in the world. Then he set out to consider how it happened. But everything was inexplicable and obscure to him. His happiness had vanished like a dream, and its memory haunted him like a nightmare. But how he had been cast off from the glory of the one into the wretchedness of the other, he was unable to understand. It was not the Lord who had taken it, it was an accident. Or he assured himself that it was the deceit and cunning of men or their manifest violence which had wrested it from him, as the Sabians had destroyed Job's herds and their keepers. Then his soul became rebellious against men. He believed he did God justice by not reproaching him. He fully understood how it happened, and the more immediate explanation was that those men had done it. And furthermore, it was because the men were evil and their hearts perverted. He understood that men are his neighbors to his injury. Would he perhaps have understood it in the same way if they had benefited him? But that the Lord who dwells far away in heaven might be nearer to him than the man who lived next to him. Whether that man did him good or evil, such an idea was remote from his thought. Or he fully understood how it had happened and knew how to describe it with all the eloquence of horror. For why should he not understand that when the sea rages in its fury, and when it flings itself against the heavens, then men and their frail accomplishments are tossed about as in a game? That when the storm rushes forth in its violence, human enterprises are mere child's play? That when the earth trembles in terror of the elements and the mountains groan, then men and their glorious achievements sink as nothing into the abyss? And this explanation was adequate for him, and above all, sufficient to make his soul indifferent to everything. For it is true that what is built on sand does not even need a storm to overthrow it. But would it not also be true that a man cannot build and dwell elsewhere and be sure his soul is safe? Or he understood that he himself had merited what had befallen him, that he had not been prudent. For had he rightly calculated in time, it would not have happened. And this explanation explained everything by first explaining that he had corrupted himself and made it impossible for him to learn anything from life, and especially impossible for him to learn anything from God. After the news, Job did not forget to praise his Lord. His feelings towards God did not change, and God himself did not change. Kierkegaard says, "Blessed be the name of the Lord." Hence, Job not only overcame the world, but he did what Paul had desired his striving congregation to do. After having overcome everything, he stood. Alas, perhaps there has been someone in the world who overcame everything, but who failed in the moment of victory. The Lord's name be praised, hence the Lord remained the same, and ought he not to be praised as always? Or had the Lord really changed? Or did not the Lord in truth remain the same as did Job? The Lord's name be praised. Hence the Lord did not take everything, for he did not take away Job's praise and his peace of heart and the sincerity of faith from which it issued. But his confidence in the Lord remained with him as before, perhaps more fervently than before. For now there was nothing at all which could in any way divert his thought from God. The Lord took it all. Then Job gathered together all his sorrows and cast them upon the Lord, and then he also took those from him, and only praise remained in the incorruptible joy of his heart. For Job's house was a house of sorrow, if ever a house was such. But where this word is spoken, "Blessed be the name of the Lord," there gladness also has its home. Lastly, Kierkegaard ends the discourse with some advice. He says, "We have spoken about Job and have sought to understand him in his devout expression, without the speech wishing to force itself upon anyone. But should it therefore be entirely without significance or application and concern no one? If you yourself, my hearer, have been tried as Job was, and have stood the testing as he did, then it truly applies to you, if we have spoken rightly about Job. If hitherto you have not been tested in life, then it indeed implies to you. Do you think perhaps that these words apply only under such extraordinary circumstances as those in which Job was placed? Is it perhaps your belief that if such a thing struck you, then the terror itself would give you strength, develop within you that humble courage? Did not Job have a wife? What do we read about her? Perhaps you think that terror cannot get as much power over a man as can the daily thraldom in much smaller adversities. Then look you to it that you, as little as any man, do not become enslaved by some tribulation, and above all, learn from Job to be sincere with yourself, so that you may not delude yourself by an imagined strength, through which you experience imaginary victories in an imaginary conflict. Or perhaps you believe that such a thing cannot happen to you. Who taught you this wisdom? Or on what do you base your assurance? Are you wise and understanding, and is this your confidence? Job was the teacher of many. Are you young, and your youth your assurance? Job had also been young. Are you old, on the verge of the grave? Job was an old man when sorrow overtook him. Are you powerful? Is this your assurance of immunity? Job was reverenced by the people. Are riches your security? Job possessed the blessing of lands. Are your friends your guarantors? Job was loved by everyone. Do you put your confidence in God? Job was the Lord's confidant. Have you reflected on these thoughts, or have we not rather avoided them, so that they might not extort from you a confession, which you now perhaps call a melancholy mood? And yet there is no hiding place in the wide world where troubles may not find you, and there has never lived a man who was able to say more than you can say, that you do not know when sorrow will visit your house. So be sincere with yourself. Fix your eyes upon Job. Even though he terrifies you, it is not this he wishes, if you yourself do not wish it. You still could not wish, when you survey your life and think of its end, that you should have to confess, "I was fortunate, Not like other men. I have never suffered anything in the world, and I have let each day have its own sorrows, or rather, bring me new joys. Such a confession, even if it were true, you could still never wish to make. It would involve your own humiliation. For if you had been preserved from sorrow as no other had, you would still say, I have indeed not been tested in it, but still my mind has frequently occupied itself since seriously with the thought of Job, and with the idea that no man knows the time and the hour when the messengers will come to him, each one more terrifying than the last.